woman in the Old Testament who became queen of Persia, Esther. But first, let's begin with a word of prayer. God of justice, you sent your servant Esther into a life of privilege so that those without privilege would be taken care of. In our privilege, show us how to advocate for those who have less, so that your world might be peaceful and just. We pray these things in the name of Jesus Christ, our Savior and our Lord. Amen. We're going to be slightly less organized than usual because we're trying to do this in a slightly different way, so bear with us. But I wanted to say a word before we begin about pronunciation, because pronunciation of Hebrew in particular and Greek also, names of places and people, is always a bugaboo. I always tell people, decide on a pronunciation and just go with it and just be consistent, because there's not only do we sometimes not actually know how things are pronounced, would have been pronounced 4,000 years ago, but there are multiple versions of what is a correct pronunciation. And so as an example, I wanted to tell you the name of the king today. It's spelled Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus. If you go online, there's a website called netministries.org. It's actually very good. They give you pronunciations for tons of good names. It's all alphabetized, so you can click on them. They tell you to pronounce this roughly. Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus. If you go and look at the Hebrew, and I have a program on my computer where they include a reading of the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew. So if you listen to that and listen for the name is Ahasuerus. A little bit different. So we're going to call him Xerxes, because that's his Greek name. You go through this with cities, with everything. So bear with us, and just keep that in mind when you hear people talk. We put questions into the bulletin today. I don't know how many of you noticed them. But we decided that would help focus us and give you something to think about. And we want to start with some background about the story. So, Beth, you want to give them some background? Well, let me start with this. Okay, we start with, it takes place in Persia. It takes place in the capital of Persia, which was a town called Susa. Actually, it's called Susa in some places. In the Hebrew, it's actually called Shushan, but we'll call it Susa just to simplify things. Persia was a huge empire at this time. This is during the time of King Xerxes, and he reigned for 20 years. This takes place starting the beginning of the book is the 3rd year of his reign, and then when most of the action is taking place, it's like the 7th year of his reign. But we're talking about 480 BC, so 480 years before Christ. It was a huge empire. It went from India to
Ethiopia.
Thank you. India, and it had 127 provinces. Okay. So we have a bunch of different characters.
Okay. The characters in this book are, of course, Esther, and her Jewish name is Hadassah, and her cousin is Mordecai, and he is a scribe in the king's court. There's also a gentleman by the name of Haman, the Agagite, and he's kind of a shady character because he is descended from the Amalekites, who go back centuries to King Saul, and God commanded Saul to eliminate the Amalekites. They had been enemies of the Jews and the Israelites back to the Exodus.
Yeah, back to the Exodus. They actually attacked during the
And
Exodus.
what happened is Saul didn't obey. He did not annihilate them. And as a result, Haman was allowed to become a descendant, and he was, I don't want to say he was the vizier, but he was very close to King Xerxes. And Haman was the enemy in this story. It was post-exile, after the exile of the Jewish people. They had been allowed to go back to Jerusalem, but for whatever reason, Mordecai and Hadassah had stayed with several other of the Israelites.
It's actually interesting to go back and try and find out more about the characters. I was working with a Jewish study Bible. It's a Tanakh translation, and then it's put out by the Jewish Publications Society. So it's got notes from a different perspective, often very much the same as the notes you'd find in any of our study Bibles, but it's got some other notes. It actually says that Mordecai's role for the king was that he was a member of the king's secret police, and his job was to ferret out plots against the king, which I've never seen anywhere else, but it's an interesting thing given how the story develops. One other thing of note is that Esther and Mordecai are foreigners, they're Jews in Persia, but Haman, the bad guy, is also a bad foreigner. So everybody there is foreigners. Esther was orphaned, and Mordecai raised her. He actually, I guess, legally adopted her and raised her. So he was the sort of parent. She was young. She's young when this story happens, and beautiful. And the words that describe her, it says in our English translation, fair and beautiful. If you go back and look, it's the first word that we give as fair is describing her physical appearance. She was beautiful in appearance and form. And the second one is talking about her personality, I guess we would say, that she's a beautiful person inside too. So she's she's the ultimate good person in this story, which I guess is why it's named after her. So we have this feud between Haman and the Jews, and this goes back, like she said, to the Exodus. The Jewish Study Bible actually says the rabbis traced the Amalekites back to Esau, and see that rivalry between Esau and Jacob playing out all the way down. But needless to say, they're long time enemies, and that's also critical to what happens. Vashti gets a short mention, sure, really short mention.
Well, yeah, but to kind of set this up in the way that Esther became the queen was, the king had a wife, and her name was Vashti, and she refused to come to him when he commanded her to come to his court. We're not real sure why she refused, but because she refused, he set her aside. And a decree went out over the entire empire for all of the young maidens to come to the palace to be trained for a year, for him to choose. They had one night with the king, and Esther, well, yeah, it was a Persian name for her. So she was part of the roundup of maidens that went to the palace and were trained,
And gets chosen.
She was chosen.
She gets chosen. Yeah, she was chosen. And she's smart enough to come when she's called. So one of the things that happens just before the passage that we're about to read, I love it when they just pick out like one chapter from an entire book. And it's not even that long a book. Mordecai is sitting by the city gate, and he overhears a conversation and basically discovers a plot to assassinate the king. He tells Esther. Esther gets the news to the king, and the plot is squelched, and the king is not assassinated. It's put into the annals of the court records or whatever, but nothing else is really done about it. The next thing that happens is that this bad guy, Haman, we say Haman in English, it's Haman in Hebrew. But anyway, the bad guy gets promoted above everybody else, all the other officials. And he's the guy who's very egotistical, and he's proud of this, and he wants everybody to bow to him. And Mordecai refuses to bow to him. Now, in our study Bibles, it says that it's really not known why he doesn't bow to him. In the Jewish study Bible, it's pretty clear that he doesn't bow to him because of this long feud, because they were enemies of the Lord. But for whatever reason, he doesn't bow to Mordecai, which makes doesn't bow to Haman, which makes Haman even angrier than he was already.
He was out to get Mordecai.
He's out to get him, but he says, rather than just get this one person, he's Jewish,
I'm gonna get on.
we're going to get all the Jews. So Haman goes to the king and has the king issue an edict that all the Jews are to be slaughtered. Just like that. And the king, he's not really paying attention and saying, yeah, okay, fine. You tell me that these people are kind of against me, okay. And he does that. The end of that chapter, this is the chapter just before we start reading. The end of that chapter, in the NRSV, it says, the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. I like the Jewish translation better. It's the king and Haman sat down to a feast, but the city was dumbfounded. Not just confusion. They were dumbfounded at this, that this was going to happen, and all the Jews were going to be slaughtered. So now we have to read it. We didn't actually read who's going to read. You want to read it? I'll read it. Okay. Actually, this is... Yeah, this is a slightly different version.
Sounds like it's a good version.
Don't you read it? Okay. Well, just because it's slightly different. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, this is about the edict, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. He went through the city, crying out loudly and bitterly, until he came in front of the palace gate, for one could not enter the palace gate wearing sackcloth. Also, in every province that the king's command and decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and everybody lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maidens and eunuchs came and informed her, the queen was greatly agitated. She sent clothing for Mordecai to wear, so that he might take off his sackcloth, and come in. But he refused. Thereupon Esther summoned Hatak, one of the eunuchs whom the king had appointed to serve her, and sent him to Mordecai to learn why and wherefore of it all. Hatak went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the palace gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and all about the money that Haman had offered to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. That's a detail we left out. Haman, when he goes to the king and tries to get the edict passed, says, and here's 10,000 talents of silver that I'll put in your treasury to fund this extermination of the Jews. He also gave, Mordecai also gave Hatak the written text of the law that had been proclaimed in Shushan and Susa for their destruction. He bade him show it to Esther and inform her and charge her to go to the king and to appeal to him and to plead with him for her people. When Hatak came and delivered Mordecai's message to Esther, Esther told Hatak to take back to Mordecai the following reply. All the king's couriers and the people of the king's provinces know that if any person, man or woman, enters the king's presence in the inner court without having been summoned, there is but one law for him, that he be put to death. Only if the king extends the golden scepter to him may he live. Now I have not been summoned to visit the king for the last 30 days. When Mordecai was told what Esther had said, Mordecai had this message delivered to Esther. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal position for just such a crisis. Then Esther sent back this answer to Mordecai, go assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan and Susa, and fast in my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will observe the same fast. Then I shall go to the king, though it's contrary to the law, and if I am to perish, I shall perish. So Mordecai went about the city and did just as Esther had commanded. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Now that's where our reading is supposed to end. But we thought it would be fair to you to tell you the end of the story, rather than just leave you hanging. Beth?
Well, despite this edict, and you have to give Esther some props, because she did come to understand that she had to act. And she said, if I perish, I perish. It's very brave of her. So she went to the king. She went before him, and he could save her by holding out his golden scepter. And when she appeared before him, uninvited, he did hold out the scepter for her. She asked him and Haman to come. She was going to prepare a meal for them and for the next night, and they accepted. So she had dinner prepared. They came and they ate. And Haman was thinking, this is pretty cool. The queen is acknowledging me, and this is nice.
I'm the only one here with the king.
Exactly. So they had dinner, and Esther asked them to come to dinner a second night, which might make you wonder, what? Why would she do this? Well, I think that she's setting up Haman, making him feel very powerful and important. And the second night that they came, she revealed herself. Now, I went a little ahead of myself. Haman had a 75-foot, what do you call it? Where they hang people.
No, to impale him.
Gallows.
Not a gallows, but to impale.
Well, he had something built
Yeah.
for Mordecai to be killed on.
Right.
And at this second dinner, she revealed to the king that she was a Jew and that Mordecai was going to be killed, as were they all. And I don't know if the king left and came back, but he found Haman begging her to help him out.
And he's on her couch.
On her couch, yes.
Not a good place to be.
And the king comes in and sees this, and in a rage, he has Haman killed on the very gallows that was made for Mordecai. And because the edict had gone out, it couldn't be rescinded. But they sent out a second decree that the Jews could defend themselves. And when the time happened that they were going to be slaughtered, they fought back. God was with them, and they won their freedom against the oppression. And as a result, the Jews celebrate a holiday called Purim, which is that they remember that God preserved them in Persia, and Esther played her part.
Uh-oh, are we taking questions from the audience?
Sure.
As part of the celebration, they make triangular-shaped cookies that are called hamantaschen, which means Haman's hat. Because Haman wore this triangular-shaped hat. Margie Goldstein told me that.
I think we had some last year when we kind of celebrated Purim. That's right. It's a very fast, fun holiday for everyone.
It's a carousing kind
It's
of holiday.
celebratory.
It's, yes, parties and gifts and all kinds of fun stuff. Yes. The other thing that kind of happens in the background is that there's a night where the king can't really sleep. And I guess he thinks if I read something really boring, I'll go to sleep. And he gets up and starts reading the court records. And he stumbles across the part about Mordecai saving him from the assassins. And so he has this in his head when he hears about this plot to kill all the Jews and finds out that this man who saved him was one of the people. In fact, he asks Haman, when Haman comes in as he's reading that, and he says to Haman, what would you do for a man who did a great thing for the king? And Haman, being egotistical, thinks, well, he's thinking of me. And so he comes up with all these things. He should give him horses that the king has ridden, and give him fine clothes, and give him this and that, and the other goes on and on and on, all the things that this person should get. And the king says, give those things to Mordecai, because he saved me from it. And so Haman has to actually go out and do all this for Mordecai, which makes him even angrier, of course.
Yes.
So there's all these things playing. At the very end, the Jews did survive. They did more than survive. They conquered the people who came to fight with them. But over and over again, it tells us they took no spoils. took no spoils. It's just a little phrase, it's easy to miss. When, in the original battles with Saul, when they were fighting against the Amalekites, when they were fighting against these people, the Lord told Saul to basically take no prisoners. Kill them all, kill everything, take nothing, take no spoils. And Saul didn't do that. He let the king survive. He took some spoils for the temple, but he was not supposed to take anything. And so the fact that the Jews in this, at the end, when they do this fighting and they kill all these people and they take no spoils, they're righting that wrong.
Exactly.
That's Saul. So that's the book as a whole. So one of the things we wanted to talk about was how Esther, our question says Esther seems to change her attitude in verse 15. And after rereading it, after we put these questions together, I really came to the conclusion that she didn't really change her mind there. It's just that I didn't really understand her previous comment. Okay, so when the conversation is going back between her and Mordecai, and he says, we're in trouble, and she says, well, it's really dangerous to go into to the king, if you go into this like this, and he says, well, you're not going to survive either, and she goes, okay, pray for me, blah, blah, blah. So, I kept thinking when she sent back and said, well, fast for me and I'll do this, that was her change. But thank God for this Jewish study Bible pointed out that obviously there were other ways to get this news to the king. Because when there was an assassination plot, she got that news to the king. And it says very specifically if you go to the inner court without invitation. So from that very moment when she says, if you go to the inner court, she's already thinking in the most daring way of how she can go in person. Which brings me to the question of, why would she do it that way? Why wouldn't she go the simpler route of sending a message in through somebody else, or however she got the other news to him?
And it was before the whole court.
Right. So one question might be that, one answer might be that she didn't know who to trust. That to say it in open court might alert somebody, that her voice might get silenced, or the king might get distracted. He doesn't seem to be very well focused, and then the message would be lost. And that she needed to be there in person, giving him the message. But she rises to that challenge.
Yes, Linda.
I think she may have, you have to remember she was married to him, so she may have had the thought that maybe he'll hear me out because I am the queen. You have to, because she was already the queen.
Yeah.
She was the queen, but keep in mind this is a time when there's an entire harem.
Yeah.
And he got rid of the one just for not coming once.
Yeah.
It's
What is the thought?
not quite the marital relationship we think of with two people.
Oh, but I like to
Spend a lot of time.
think it was. That he loved her.
Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
so. But he had a whole harem of women, let's not forget. Seriously, she needed to be careful because she could be so easily replaced.
To be replaced.
She could be so easily replaced.
Yes. But can you imagine what it was like for her going from a very, poor young Jewish woman to being the queen of Persia? I mean, that's...
There was a flitter there in her heart. There was something that she felt that she could go there.
Well, I'm not sure about how confident she was. I mean, when you end your sentence with, if I perish, I perish, I think you're maybe giving your chances 50-50, but I don't know that you're really confident that you're going to be able to pull this off. But I think maybe one of the reasons that she wanted to go in person, face to face, was that she was so horrified by this that she wanted that emotion to come across. Because she wanted the king to know that this wasn't just, hey honey, if you got a time, can you do this for the kingdom? But hey, this is personal. I'm going to die. And she needed to get that across to him. There's a lot of talk about why this book is in the Bible at all, because God is never mentioned directly. Nobody prays. An awful lot of people argued against having this book in the Bible, both from the Jewish and the Gentile side. But There are several reasons we can think of.
Well, it's suggested that this is showing God working behind the scenes. Because we know that he gave Saul the edict to destroy the Amalekites, and then we have Haman popping up in Persia in a high position of power, and he is intent on destroying the Jews. And how, out of an empire that stretches from India to Ethiopia, with all of the maidens gathered to be chosen from, our little Esther is the one that gets picked. She was where she was supposed to be, and her faith was such that she asked all of the Jews to fast for her. And I'm not real knowledgeable about what fasting means. I should probably study that, but it was something to them. It had real meaning to them that they would be willing to go without food or water for 3 days, as I guess a show of faith.
Yes.
that God would be with them through this, and
If
he would, yeah.
If you think of David fasting, when they were afraid his child would die, the child would die. That's that same thing. It's an appeal to God, I think, in that one.
If I might, in our daily walk and in our lives, there are times when we spiritually are low. And if we learn to use fasting in its proper sense, Esther was a woman of fasting and faith. Anytime that I have a really difficult time, I use fasting within myself. And it may not be food, it may be something that I really enjoy doing. Maybe perhaps I don't get to read a book for 2 or 3 days. But fasting is something that you learn to do individually and independently. And when you do it with an open heart, God sees that, much as he did with Esther. Look at what Esther became. Esther became one of the strongest, principled women in the Bible. If we could all just be a little bit like her, man, I think God would be cool.
So,
May I just read an application, please, quickly?
Sure.
As we can, it says, this word mentioned where Pastor had mentioned that God's name is not in the book. The application says, as we confront situations in life, we should remember these come directly or indirectly from God. We should therefore seek to accomplish his will in every circumstance. So, as far as Esther, as Pastor Beth said, she was at the right place at the right time because that's where God wanted her. So this whole thing, even though God's not mentioned, it is his will that's going to be done.
okay, so we weren't quite finished with that conversation about whether God was in the book or not. If you give us a chance.
Good points. Good points.
But good points. Yes. When Mordecai says to her, if you don't do this, relief or help will come from another source.
God will provide.
The words that he uses, it gets translated as from another quarter. The word in Hebrew is from another place. That idea of place, from another place, those words are used over and over again to mean basically from God, or from a holy place. So that's an oblique reference to God there. And I would agree that fasting is a way to reach out, and in particular, doing it in community the way they did. There's a couple of other reasons why this might have remained in the Bible. It's not in the Jewish Bible, it's with the writings at the end. It's not among the prophets or the history, it's with the writings. And it's the only real story we have in the Bible about Jews in the exile, about what life was like for them, about the diaspora, the Jews who lived elsewhere. And so it's important in that way. It's also the idea that, and in particular just the history of the Jewish community throughout history, is that they've been used as scapegoats. They've been picked out as the foreigners who are dangerous. They've been picked out as people to be slaughtered. And this gives a strong message of God's support for them and God's God being against their being used that way. This is true for the Jews, but I think we also have to hear this message beyond just the Jews, to hear it as any group of people who are vulnerable, any group of people who are foreigners in a land, who are subject to government edicts and subject to whims of the people in power, and who are really at the mercy of those people, that God stands with those people. One of the other questions we asked is whether this is a true story. So, there's lots of pros and cons. There's mostly cons, actually. Now, let's start by saying that there are many ways that a story can be true. A story can be true because historically these people did these things. It can be true because those people really existed and maybe they did something sort of like that, and so the story and the legend grows around them. It can be true even if none of those things are actually facts, if the underlying message that is being told is a truth. Right? Okay, so there's no mention of the known historical events from this king's reign. And in fact, during the time of the Persian invasion of Greece is when this story pictures him in Susa having his beauty pageant picking out his next queen. So that kind of jolts with real history. There's various historical and chronological inaccuracies. There's a reference to the Jews as scattered abroad, which was not particularly true at this time. It was more true later, which gives it a kind of strange setting. It's pretty much unbelievable that Esther, even with a Persian name like Esther, would be known as the cousin and adopted daughter of Mordecai, who was Jewish and in the king's employ, without people knowing that she was Jewish. The fact that that keeps this hidden all the way through the book is just not really credible unless the king is even denser than he seems to be. There's an insignificant Jewish minority in Persia at the time of this story, and they killed 75,000 Persians. Is not particularly easy to believe. The fact that Haman erects a 7-story stake to impale his enemy, a 7-story stake outside his house. I mean, this is just kind of exaggeration, if you will.
And it was believed that Haman had 10 sons, and they were all killed as well.
Okay. And then he offers the 10,000 talents of silver. This is like, they say it estimated as 333 tons of silver, which is close to the total sum of the annual tribute of the entire Persian Empire. So the numbers are, a lot of the story is just exaggerated, yeah. On the other hand, there's a high degree of accuracy apparently in the presentation of the details of the Persian court life. That very much rings true. And there was a cuneiform text discovered that mentions a high official at Susa during the early years of Xerxes' reign named Marduk, which is the Persian version of Mordecai. Esther is a credible Persian feminine name, meaning star. So there's this possibility that it's true. So one of the things the scholars think is that this was written by a Jew who did not live at that time, who lived later, but who lived in or near Persia, so they knew Persian life. There are apparently a lot of words in it borrowed from the Persian. So the scholars who look at the language kinds of things say that that would make sense if the author was actually Persian. And that it was written this long time afterwards, and that also explains, okay, scholars look at all these things. Who knew about this story? How did it end up in the Bible? How did it end up in particular in the New Testament, in the Christian Bible? The story, the book of Esther has not been found, at least as of the late 70s when my books are from, It has not been found anywhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which has all the books that were written in the Palestinian area. Esther's not among them. But they believe it was translated into Greek as early as, 75 BC, which is before or around the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it was known in a wider sense, but not in the Palestine area. Again, saying that it was probably written by someone there, that it was a popular story there. It became very popular in Palestine in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, when it caught on there.
They do celebrate Purim, so.
They do celebrate Purim, right. So, and the idea that one of the reasons it got kept was because it does celebrate this, give a story behind this celebration. So one of the thoughts that the scholars have is that there was something like this happen, there was an incident, there was Mordecai, there was an Esther, there was this kind of an event, and it's been, that the book is written in a more exaggerated fashion, right?
More of a
Keep coming back to
show.
exaggerated.
A show.
Yeah.
I mean, it was something to entertain.
Yes, the Jewish Study Bible begins by saying that this book should be read as a comedy. And if you think of a comedy as in the Greek play sense, something's either a comedy or it's a tragedy. A comedy is something that has a good ending. But it's also something that perhaps you have a bit of farce, you have a bit of slapstick, you have a bit of seven-story impaling things that then you end up on instead of the other guy. So there's a bit of
And the
this sort of thing
small
going on.
underdogs beating the big guys.
Right, exactly. But we come back to, it's in the Bible, and what message do we take from it? As we walk away from here, what do we learn from this, and how does this change our lives? This word. So I was going to just say we should leave that as an exercise for the interested student, but no. I come back to what several of you have said, that Esther was in a place and a time when something was going to happen and action was needed. And that she was called to take that action. And in her case, it was a position of privilege that gave her power to help those who did not have privilege. And that one of the things that struck me as I thought more about this, you can say, okay, so what position are we in? What things do we need to take action about? But I come back to that one thing that changed for me about why she needed to see the king in person, was that she needed to convince him that this was personal, that this was affecting her. And I think many times when we look around the world and we say, well, this needs to be fixed, or that needs to be fixed, or those people need to be helped, we don't look at it with that same sense of personal involvement. We look at it as, here I am and those people need help. Not as, I stand with those people, I will live or die with them, they need help, I will be there. What can I do for them beyond what I might do for, somebody around the world? How do we look around our lives and see where we're called to be that close to somebody in need?
I think that's it. That we are supposed to look around our lives and see
Who's vulnerable?
who's vulnerable and what can we do. We are put here for a reason, for such a time as this.
Yes. God is good.
All the time.
All the time.
All the time.
God is good.
God is good.